Chronicles is another name for the histories of, the chronicles of. C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, didn't he? It's the history of Narnia, an imaginary land that he wrote about. But Chronicles 1 and 2 are books in the Bible. So if you have a Bible, page 406. 2 Chronicles, chapter 36. The last chapter of 2 Chronicles, if that helps. We'll get there. See, I told you we didn't go there very often. It's showing, isn't it? 2 Chronicles 36, 11 to 23. Before I read it, we've been doing a series over the last few Sunday mornings, giving an overview of the Bible. By an overview, we mean showing the Bible's story from beginning to end, because it is one complete story running all the way through. It doesn't always feel like it, I guess, if you pick up a Bible. It's got 66 different books in it. They can all feel very different, but they are telling one story. And it's really the story of God's presence amongst his people. It was there in Eden right at the beginning with Adam and Eve. It was lost when they sinned and rebelled against God. It was promised to Abraham as God chose Abraham early on in Genesis. It then begins to be fulfilled in the history of Israel. It's then completely fulfilled in Jesus, but there's still more to come with the new creation. That's the arc of the story. And in the new creation, we'll be fully in God's presence if we're people who have trusted in Jesus. We're kind of halfway through the story when we get to 2 Chronicles 36. Chronicles is the story of Israel and Judah's kings. And we're going to read about the end almost of the kings, at least for a time, for the kingdom of Judah. So it's 2 Chronicles 36, verse 11. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. That's king of Judah. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and did not humble himself before the prophet Jeremiah at the Lord's command. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, that's the king of Babylon, who was the superpower of the day, who had made him swear allegiance by God. He became obstinate and hardened his heart against returning to the Lord, the God of Israel. All the leaders of the priests and the people multiplied their unfaithful deeds, imitating all the detestable practices of the nations. And they defiled the Lord's temple. That's where God lived amongst his people, where his presence was. They defiled the Lord's temple that he had consecrated in Jerusalem. But the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word against them by the hand of his messengers, sending them time and time again. For he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept ridiculing God's messengers, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the Lord's wrath was so stirred up against his people that there was no remedy. So he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, that's Nebuchadnezzar, who killed their fit young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He had no pity on young men or young women, elderly or aged. He handed them all over to him. He took everything to Babylon, all the articles of God's temple, large and small, the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. Then the Chaldeans burned God's temple. They tore down Jerusalem's walls, burned all its palaces, and destroyed all its valuable articles. He deported those who escaped from the sword to Babylon, and they became servants to him and his sons until the rise of the Persian kingdom. This fulfilled the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, and the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest, all the days of the desolation, until 70 years were fulfilled. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom and also to put it in writing. This is what the king Cyrus of Persia says: "The Lord, the God of the heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord his God be with him." Amen. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, we're continuing our series in a Bible overview this morning, working our way through the story of the Bible from, well, we actually started at the end, didn't we? Revelation, to see where it's supposed to all end up. And then we went to the beginning, Genesis, and worked through. If you remember last time, or if you weren't here last time, let me tell you where we got to. Last week, we got to the point where Abraham's promises, the promises to Abraham given by God, of God's people, in God's place, under his rule, will know the blessing of his presence with them. That's where we got to. And it was reaching its high point in the Old Testament where we finished last time. So, God had promised that Abraham's descendants would be his people. And sure enough, God had rescued them out of slavery in Egypt, a people for himself. He had promised that they would have a place where they would live, that would be their land. And that's the book of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. And the land is where they live. He promised that they would have a king who would rule over them under God. And sure enough, David becomes king, a man after God's own heart. And then his son Solomon succeeds him as king. And under Solomon, what happens is that God's presence comes to dwell in Jerusalem. Solomon builds the temple. And God's glory in a cloud fills the temple, and he is with them. It's the high point of the Old Testament partial fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. God's people, the Israelites. In God's place, the promised land of Canaan. Under God's rule, David, Solomon. Knowing the blessing of his presence, the temple. But I hinted last time, and the Bible hints all the way through, that it wasn't going to last. That high point of the Old Testament would prove to be just that, the high point that they've reached before things start to come down. And this morning we reach a much more gloomy period in the Bible's story that will eventually lead to the new creation. We reach what the Bible calls the exile. The exile. So, hopefully you've got a handout in front of you that will help you follow where we're headed with this part of the Bible story. And the big idea, if you like, of this morning and what we're looking at is what happens when God's people rebel. When God's presence subsequently departs. So we saw last week, actually, that God warned that if his people disobeyed his commands, and his commands, remember, are a law of love, to love him and to love one another. But if the people didn't do that, if they failed to love in the way God had told them they should, then that would lead to exile. Well, his people persistently rejected, actually, his presence, rejected his rule. The exile came, it lost them, it cost them the land, it cost them their king, it cost them the temple. We read all about that just before in 2 Chronicles 36. That's what was happening. They lost the felt nearness of God. And again, God had said that would happen if they didn't love him and love others. So let's see where God had warned it. Where did he say it would happen? He said it right when he first rescued them from slavery in Egypt. So he rescued them from slavery in Egypt. There was then that time wandering in the wilderness for 40 years before they went into the land. But just before they went into the land, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the last book before God's people enter the promised land, there's a couple of chapters of blessings if they keep loving God and one another, but curses if they don't. And amongst those curses was a warning: you'll lose the land. You'll go into exile. You'll lose my presence in the temple and your king. As you read through the Bible, you'll come across some books that are called the prophets. The prophets. There's lots of them in the Old Testament. Some are called the major prophets. They write big, long books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Others are known as the minor prophets. They write much shorter books, like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. But what the prophets do is repeatedly call people back to loving God and loving one another. They repeatedly point out to the people of Israel, when they're not doing it, and they often were not doing it, you're not loving as you should. And they repeat warnings. They expose idolatry, in other words, worshipping other gods instead of the God who loved them. They expose injustice, false worship, trust in religious symbols. Maybe I can just read you one of these. This is from Isaiah. Isaiah was one of the prophets to Old Testament Israel. He was around in the time of about 700 to 740 BC. So what's that? 2,760 years ago. It's a long time. But he was speaking to them. This is just before the first exile, which is the northern kingdom, happens. Here's what he says. He's telling them God's words, not just his own. What are all your sacrifices to me? Asks the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of well-fed cattle. I have no desire for the blood of bulls, lambs, or male goats. So that's to do with the Old Testament sacrificial system. It actually points forward to Jesus dying on the cross. But it wasn't meant to be trusted in just a mechanical way. If we just sacrifice the animal, everything will be fine. God's not happy with that. He says in verse 12 of Isaiah 1, when you come to appear before me, so when they come to the temple with their sacrifices, who requires this from you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing useless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons and Sabbaths and the calling of solemn assemblies. I cannot stand iniquity with a festival. God had commanded these festivals, actually, of new moons, Sabbaths, assemblies, but if they were doing it whilst just completely singing against him, he hated that. I hate your new moons and prescribed festivals. They become a burden to me. I'm tired of putting up with them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will refuse to look at you. Even if you offer countless prayers, I will not listen. And then he says, why? Your hands are covered with blood. That's really evocative, isn't it? I had to study Macbeth at school when I was doing my GCSEs. And Lady Macbeth in that play, this is the only thing I remember about it really, Lady Macbeth is the one who plots all the murders, because there's lots of murders. But there's a scene where she's desperately trying to wash her hands because they're stained with blood. At least she's trying to wash them. The Israelites weren't even trying to wash their hands. And they were covered in blood. Verse 16, God says, wash yourselves, cleanse yourselves, remove your evil deeds from my sight. Stop doing evil. Learn to do what is good. Pursue justice, correct the oppressor, defend the rights of the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Do you see what he's saying? He's basically saying to the Israelites, I hate empty religion. I hate just turning up, if we put it in New Testament terms and our terms, I hate just turning up at church on a Sunday morning, but through the week you've completely ignored me, lied at work, cheated, done wrong. Don't do that, God says. Better you don't turn up at all than do that. But this is the state that Old Testament Israel had got themselves into over generations, under kings that didn't lead well. So when exile comes, it's not an accident. It's something that God had said would happen if their lives were not those of love to him and others. You can track this decline of Israel through the Old Testament, through books like 1 and 2 Chronicles or 1 and 2 Kings. Let me just give a very, very quick overview. Last time we left off with Solomon's reign. King Solomon reigned over the whole of Israel. He was David's son. David had been the first king of Israel after God's own heart. But Solomon's reign ends in 1 Kings 11 with, actually, Solomon no longer loving God and others as he should. He's already begun to go off track. And eventually he dies, and what happens is his son Rehoboam comes to the throne. But Rehoboam doesn't even start well. Rehoboam goes wrong from the beginning. He basically oppresses the people. He doesn't love them. And the kingdom splits. There's a rebellion. One of Solomon's servants, senior servants, when Solomon was king, a man called Rehoboam, is actually told by God, 10 tribes of the 12 in Israel are going to follow you. And sure enough, they do. And you get what's called the northern kingdom of Israel. 2 will be left in the south, where Jerusalem and the temple is. And they will be under Rehoboam's reign, Rehoboam the son of Solomon. It can get quite confusing in the Bible as you read through, that you've got these 2 kingdoms now, not just one. But it's a result of rebellion against God. The kingdom splits. So you have Israel in the north, initially under Jeroboam, but Jeroboam doesn't turn out to be a good king. He's definitely not descended from David's line, that's worth pointing out. He leads the people into idolatry, and so do all the kings who come after him in Israel in the north. In the south, you have Judah, initially Rehoboam is king, and it follows David's line. So they're descendants of David and Solomon who come to the throne in Judah, where Jerusalem is the capital. And at times, there are kings who reform things and bring people back to loving God and loving others. There are better kings. The highlight is a king called Josiah, who was actually very young when he came to the throne. But he did a whole, I think they call it root and branch reform now, don't they? Well, that was Josiah. But it didn't last. The trajectory is still away from God on the whole. So you can read in 2 Kings 17 that Israel is exiled into Assyria. That's in about 722 BC. So you still had Isaiah on the scene at that point. Israel is exiled by Assyria and never returns. That's them gone. Remember, they had followed the non-Davidic line, and it was David who was promised one who would eventually turn out to be Jesus. Judah is not sent into exile straight away. There are these occasional reforms. They do occasionally turn back to God. But what happens to Israel, basically God says to them, that's a warning to you, Judah. Sure enough, we read about it earlier, under King Zedekiah, Judah ends up in exile too. Zedekiah, we read, did evil in the sight of the Lord. He didn't love. Judah is exiled into Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. That's in 586 BC. And you can read that in where we read it in 2 Chronicles or in 2 Kings, chapter 25. And it's disastrous, isn't it? Like I say, for the Israelites in the north, they never come back. They're dispersed through the Assyrian Empire, because Assyria had a big empire. They never get to come back to the land that God had given them. It's gone. For Judah, they end up in exile, as we'll see, for 70 years. I don't want to jump ahead too much, because next time we'll think about the return. But they also end up in exile. Many of their people killed. Many of them carted off into slavery. Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem burned down. The temple burned by fire and gone. That's the place where God dwelt amongst his people. And the great lament of God's people in exile is that God has abandoned us. God has abandoned us. We no longer have his presence with us. We'll think a little bit about the book of Ezekiel next time. It's one of the most puzzling books in the Bible to many of us. But the lament in exile is that the Spirit of God left the temple. He was no longer with them. They no longer knew his blessing through his presence. Imagine if the Bible ended there. We wouldn't be here if the Bible ended there. But what did the exile expose? And this is really important for understanding the Bible storyline. It's not that God's plan A has gone wrong. Sometimes people think like that. God had a plan A, which was Israel. And he made these promises to Abraham. God's people, in God's place, under his rule. They'll know the presence of his blessing. And he began to fulfill them. And it begins to happen with the Exodus out of Israel, out of Egypt, out of slavery, into the promised land. They have a king. They have God's presence in the temple. This is plan A. And then plan A goes wrong. God has to think of a plan B. That's not what's going on. What all this history of Israel does for us is it exposes something about the human condition that's really important for us to understand. Here's what the exile exposed. Having a land, given by God even, doesn't fix the human heart. They received the promised land, but even when they're living in it, their hearts are wrong. So having a king who rules, who points people to the law, or surely that'll help. Good leadership. That'll sort everything out. Well, good leadership is good. But leadership isn't always good. And even then, it can't change the heart. The heart still has a problem. Even temples and sacrifices don't fix the heart. Let me read from Jeremiah this time. He's another of the prophets. He was around. In fact, he experienced the exile of Judah into Babylon. That's when he spoke to the people as a messenger from God. And here's what Jeremiah says about temple and sacrifices and the heart in Jeremiah 7:21 to 26. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat yourselves. For when I brought your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offering and sacrifice. However, I did give them this command: obey me. In other words, love me as I've told you to. Love others as I've told you to. Obey me, and then I will be your God, and you will be my people. Follow every way I command you, so that it may go well with you. Yet they didn't listen or pay attention, and here's the key line, but followed their own advice and their own stubborn, evil heart. They went backward and not forward. Since the day your ancestors came out of the land of Egypt until today, this is God speaking, I have sent all my servants, the prophets, to you time and time again. However, my people wouldn't listen to me or pay attention, but became obstinate. They did more evil than their ancestors. They got worse. They got worse. So what we discover in the prophets especially is the problem was not geography. The problem wasn't ritual. It was hearts. Unwilling to live with the one true God as the one true God and to follow him. Their hearts weren't doing that. That's still a problem for all of us. The Bible says that is the problem we all face when it comes to knowing God and being blessed by being his people, knowing his presence. It's our hearts. We have a heart problem. Our hearts naturally, as Jeremiah said, want to follow their own advice and their own stubborn ways. Our hearts are evil, the Bible even says. It doesn't mean people never do anything good. It doesn't mean people never show acts of love. But it does mean that they often don't and do the opposite. So into exile they go. But God has not abandoned his promises to Abraham. Remember, he had promised Abraham. Indeed, he promised right back in Genesis 3 that one day, it was described as the serpent's head will be crushed. The serpent is the devil. He had tempted Adam and Eve to rebel against God. But God had said, one day I'll crush him through a person descended from Adam and Eve. And then to Abraham he promised there will be God's people in God's place, under his rule, knowing the blessing of his presence. That will still happen, and God hadn't forgotten all those promises. Again, we wouldn't be here this morning if he had. And even in exile you can read. I've put some references down, I won't read them all now, but on the handout, even in exile, God still speaks to his people. So one of those prophets, Ezekiel, it's a big book in the Bible. Ezekiel is in exile in Babylon as he hears God's message and as he writes it down. God is still speaking to his people even as they're in exile. He's disciplining them. Actually, that's an act of love. Discipline isn't the same as retributive justice. It's restorative. That's Jeremiah 29. He promises there'll be what's called a remnant. I'm going to keep some who do love me, who do love others, who do trust me and follow me. He's going to do all of that. And yes, it's judgment, but it's also purification. It's also preparation for what's still to come. Exile is not the end of the story. But people are left asking, and we should be left asking, when we look at the subject of exile in the Bible, how can God dwell with his people without being driven away by their sin, their hearts that are turned against him? How can that happen? In a moment, we're going to sing, and then we'll take the Lord's Supper together. Now, what we remember in the Lord's Supper isn't something completely different to the Bible story and what it says about exile. Not at all. Jesus' death, that we remember with the bread as his body, the cup as his bloodshed, does link with what happens in the exile. Let me try and explain why. So that exile in the Old Testament, it wasn't just, as I said, geographical displacement. It wasn't just the people being forced to move somewhere else. Babylon, later Persia, Assyria. It was actually a rupture in their relationship with God, wasn't it? That was the main thing. So, again, Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 10 and 11, talks about God's presence being withdrawn from his people. At 2 Kings 17:25 talks about God's people being cast out, away from him. At Lamentations, a book lamenting what is happening in the exile, speaks of God's dwelling being lost. The temple is gone. Exile is the covenant curse from Deuteronomy happening. God says it's what sin deserves: separation from him, judgment from him. Jesus is the one, though, who fulfills the promise. There in Genesis 3, he'll crush the serpent's head. He fulfills the promise to Abraham of God's people in God's place under his rule, knowing his blessing and presence. But what does he undergo on the cross? Here's some of Jesus' words that he cries out from the cross as he died. My God, why have you abandoned me? That's picking up the language of exile, isn't it? The loss of God's presence. The judgment of God on sin. The exile is actually a picture of what sin deserves. Judgment and being distanced from God, separated from him. And at the cross, that is what Jesus endures for us. He's exiled at the cross, if you like, in our place. And he feels it. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? He knows why. It's not that he doesn't know. He's quoting this Psalm 22, verse 1. That psalm goes on to explain exactly what's happening, and Jesus knows. But he's bearing the curse, the covenant curse, for his people. He's taking it on himself so that his people don't have to. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament says that as he suffered, he didn't suffer in Jerusalem. He suffered outside the city gate, exiled, if you like, from Jerusalem as he died. He's not just suffering physically, he's bearing the curse. The Apostle Paul makes this absolutely clear in Galatians 3, verse 13. It's a New Testament letter that Paul writes to the New Testament church after Jesus had lived and died and risen again. This is what he says. Christ redeemed us, in other words, bought us back from the curse of the law. That's the end of Deuteronomy, curses for disobedience, which is exile. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. He took it. Jesus goes into exile. He dies. So that his people never will. Isn't that good? Isn't that loving? Isn't that amazing? He takes it on himself. He's cut off from the land of the living, Isaiah. But he promises to restore in his resurrection. He rises again, returns to his Father's right hand, having been abandoned, so that we can return with him. That's the good news. And that's part of what we're remembering in the Lord's Supper. He has borne our exile, but then returns to the Father's right hand so that we can too. The way back into God's presence is opened up. I guess this morning has felt quite heavy going, hasn't it? Exile is a heavy theme because it is judgment. It is God's settled judgment on a heart that doesn't love him, that doesn't love others, that is turned away from him and others so much of the time. It's his judgment. But he says, if you don't want that judgment to fall on you, and he doesn't want that judgment to fall on you, it falls on Jesus when you trust him. He goes through the exile. He dies. He faces the curse for us.